Okay, so let's start with what is the Open RAN Policy Coalition. So in addition to being a member of the Venable team, I'm also a member of the Open RAN Policy Coalition team. And I'm the international director there, which basically means any engagement outside of the US government, I lead. And as I'll show you in a minute, that's been quite a lot of countries over the past 2 or 3 years that we've engaged with in a bilateral setting. The coalition itself is coming up on 3 years old now. Most of that time through COVID. So we had to do a lot of our international engagement virtually, but I'm glad to say now we're getting to do more face-to-face engagements, and certainly should the opportunity arise at some point, I would love to visit the Philippines on a future trip out there. You can see on the right-hand side of the slide the mix of companies that are members of the coalition. 57 in total, I believe, from 11 different countries. These are a mix of network operators, so NTT, Rakuten, AT&T, Vodafone, Deutsche Telekom. Most of the largest operators in the world are members of our coalition, as are some of the incumbent network infrastructure vendors like Nokia and Samsung. And then the largest group of members is folks who provide either components or new entrants into the market. The reason that we felt it was important to bring together the coalition was that following discussions around trusted vendors in the market, we saw a lot of countries moving to exclude certain vendors, and we had seen across the industry over the past couple of decades already a reduction in the number of companies that provide telecoms network infrastructure. If for those countries that we're going to exclude quote unquote untrusted vendors, that left you with only 3 players in the market, Samsung, Nokia, and Ericsson. Even with those additional vendors, you are talking about 5 companies in the market. When you're looking at such critical infrastructure, having a concentration where globally only 5 companies are providing all of the infrastructure, that was viewed as a risk, and also something which reduced the amount of competition in the market. And so we understood that governments had taken a more active role in some of those decisions, and that governments would be interested in the development of this market going forward, and that it was really important to have a group that could sit between the commercial side and the technical side of things, where you have the standards development process, and you have the engineers implementing it, and you have companies purchasing the equipment, but also government is a big stakeholder at the table, and as you'll see later in the presentation, a critical player that can accelerate the adoption of Open RAN internationally. And so we came together to kind of shape that industry government dialogue. Where do we sit within the ecosystem? There are 3 Open RAN focused associations out there that you will hear about. So the ORAN Alliance is a group that is focused primarily on the standards development. So in order to have equipment that works with one another from different vendors, you have to have standardized interfaces that all of the equipment manufacturers can build to. And so the step before that is you need to come together as an industry and figure out what those standards are going to be. And that work primarily happens within the ORAN Alliance. They have a very broad membership of 236 companies, at least at the last time we checked, as well as research institutions. It is a truly global organization. There are vendors from dozens and dozens of countries included in there. And you can see at the bottom there the list of board members of the ORAN Alliance. The second is Telecom Infra Project. So once you've got the standards, you have to take the equipment and make sure that it does in fact work with one another, and that you can plug and play equipment from different vendors and it will work well together. That work is partly done individually by companies, but Telecom Infra Project plays a role in bringing together different operators, different vendors, and doing what they call plug fests, where you effectively, the engineers get together and play around and see what performance criteria they can meet and some of the challenges of integrating from a technical perspective. And finally, there's our group, which, as I say, is focused on the policy side of things. So assuming that we get the standards right and we get the engineering right, that alone is not enough to ensure timely adoption. But there are things that governments can do to speed up that adoption curve. There are things that they can do to slow it down, normally unintentionally. And so it's important that they understand both what is happening in the market today so that they are well informed to make those decisions, and that they understand the positive and negative consequences of certain policy decisions. So we as an organization, this is a complex map, but we've had engagement in a bilateral setting with now, I think, 45 or 46 governments over the past 3 years. As you can see, they are from all across the world. Certainly East Asia, Southeast Asia is one area where we've had particular interest. Europe is another, Latin America, but and obviously the US government, but really spread globally. Before I go on to where is Open RAN today, I just want to talk through a couple of themes that frequently come up in those discussions with governments, because I think it's fairly instructive. Generally, we hear an awful lot of support for governments in realizing some of the benefits, the greater competition in the market, the quicker speed of deployments, the ability to switch out vendors if their performance is, if they're not meeting performance requirements, for instance, or a new vendor comes along that has a better capability that you want to integrate into your network. That all happens much more seamlessly. The potential for lower costs as well, both as market dynamics force vendors to compete more on price, but also as you can leverage more commercial off-the-shelf hardware within the infrastructure. Many of the benefits, there's a lot of interest amongst governments. I think as far as they look at it from a use case standpoint, a couple of areas where there's a lot of potential. One is closing the digital divide, particularly over the past few years with COVID, where a lot of schooling, a lot of work had to take place at home. It brought into sharp focus the lack of communications access for groups of people in basically every country around the world. And the potential of Open RAN to deliver cost savings, the flexibility that it gives you in terms of your network architecture, because you're not building one type of network that everybody has to leverage. You can build your network in different ways to take advantage of sort of local realities, should we say, whether that's the fiber infrastructure, whether that's the need to lower costs because certain communities can't afford certain price point, various sort of levels of flexibility. There is the potential to reach communities who have not had communications access before. From a macro level, the diversification of vendors is viewed as a significant security benefit. At the same time, obviously integrating multiple vendors into a network, having a much broader set, certainly means that supply chain security is important, and operators or systems integrators need to have a way of assessing the security worthiness of their vendors, both from a technical level, but also more generally from a non-technical standpoint. So that's an area that governments frequently ask us about. And then I would say more generally, governments have struggled to stay up to date with what's going on. It is quite a quick developing space. As with any technology adoption, you tend to find it goes fairly slowly at the start, as folks don't necessarily on the enterprise side always want to be the first one to jump in. But once a handful of people do that, you tend to find it's a pretty sharp kind of uptick in adoption, and we're already starting to see that. So one of the things that we have done is pulling together a picture of where there are global deployments, or where there are deployments around the globe. This is actually a map that we can send you a link to afterwards. You can click in on each of these green or yellow dots, and it'll give you information about who the operator is, the vendors that are involved in that deployment, the year when it was first launched, things like that. So it's quite a useful way of tracking global activity. The only thing I'd say is it's not comprehensive, right? We get this information from our members or from what we can find on the internet, but sometimes for various commercial reasons, companies won't announce immediately once they've done a deployment. So I suspect whilst we've tracked 100 deployments across 45 countries, I suspect we're probably only capturing, say, 80% of what's out there. So the real numbers are even higher, but a good starting point. I'm just going to check the chat as we go to make sure there are no questions. Good stuff. Got it. How do we start and register an Open RAN deployment? So I guess what would be a good starting point is probably reaching out to some of the key vendors that are operating in the market today, right? That already have experience. The pathway to adoption is going to very much, it could depend on a variety of factors, right? If you're doing a greenfield deployment, i.e. you have no infrastructure in place today, or there's a certain area of the country that you wanted to do a deployment in and you haven't had network infrastructure there before, it is a more simplified process because you're building from scratch. If you're building on top of a 3G or 4G network with existing infrastructure providers, then there are different factors to consider, right? Who is your incumbent vendor? To what extent are they going to help you have your equipment interact seamlessly with Open RAN vendors? What is the performance requirements that you need to meet? Because now you have much more choice in how you kind of architect your network. There is a lot bigger range in terms of the pathway to deployment. But I would say as a general rule, reaching out to some of the better known larger vendors that have been involved. So that could be an NEC, it could be a Rakuten, it could be a Mavenir. There are a number of them, and certainly I would be happy to point you towards a group of them to have a discussion, but that's probably the best place to start. Okay, so that is where we're at in terms of deployments. On the government side of things, there's been quite a lot of activity. I haven't even captured in the national section here all of the sort of pro-Open RAN policies that have been put out there, but certainly Germany, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, the UK, the US, I think have all put up funding for various Open RAN activities, whether that's incentives for procurement or investments in R&D. The US, a whole range of activities that the US is now supporting after the passage of a pretty large bill at the end of last year. On the multilateral level, the Quad has made numerous statements in support of Open RAN. The G7 and their PGII initiative have had a number of supportive comments about Open RAN, and many of the world's largest operators have signaled their intent to adopt Open RAN. So in Europe, there was this group, what they call the G5, which is the 5 largest operators in Europe: Deutsche Telekom, Orange, Telefonica, TIM, and Vodafone. Signed an MOU and have followed that up with a number of policy documents, kind of documenting the steps that they need to take to do widespread Open RAN deployments, and they've started to back that up with quite a lot of action and investment. And I expect that in a week and a half's time at Mobile World Congress, you'll see an awful lot of announcements coming out of those particular companies. The second group in the bottom right here is a group of Middle Eastern operators who, kind of like a bit of a copycat, saw what had been done in Europe and made an MOU of their own, and are also working towards widespread deployments there. We had the opportunity to chat with STC recently, and they've got some exciting developments with regards to Open RAN. In addition, they have not put out public MOUs, but the Japanese operators, KDDI, NTT, Rakuten, are all big supporters of Open RAN. Rakuten's whole network is built on Open RAN. NTT is already working on interoperability with a whole host of vendors, which you can see the list on the map that I showed you before. The US operators, Dish is the kind of the poster child, as it were. They have a global a nationwide Open RAN network, which is going to be fully operational by either the end of June or the beginning of July, which is going to cover 70% of the US population. It's already up and running in many parts of the US. So there's a little bit more info in here. I will not go through all of this, but certainly when we circulate the slides for follow-up, you can take a look through. But they are looking at, within the European MOU, at all different aspects of Open RAN. So how do we make sure we get the energy efficiency requirements we need, the network performance requirements, how do we make sure it meets our security requirements? And in each area, they've kind of worked together to identify goalposts that they want to meet, and have kind of walked through a pathway of how they're going to get there. So it's a pretty impressive commitment on their part, that whilst most of their Open RAN build-outs will be brownfield, they're building on top of existing infrastructure, because Europe's obviously a very developed market from a telecom standpoint. So they're going at this from the harder side of things. And so they understand that the pathway to get there might be multi-year rather than a one-year pathway, for instance, but they've really broken down what do we need to do at each step of the way, and how are we going to get there. So would fully expect, whether it's 5 years or 7 years or 3 years, each of those operators seems to be on a pathway to transitioning from a closed network architecture to an Open RAN architecture. One example I wanted to throw in here as well, which is from Southeast Asia, is TIP, that group that I mentioned at the beginning, the Telecom Infra Project, which does a lot of the engineering work. They have launched a kind of community lab in Indonesia, where they're working with, I believe, all of the operators, the 4 major operators in Indonesia, and they have a pathway that you can see on the left here: ideate, define, build, test, release, deploy, and they are steadily working through that, and with the expectation that at the end of the 5-year program in 2024, that we will see each of the telcos there deploying. You can see, just as an example here in this second box, middle box on the right-hand side, the range of vendors that are being integrated. You've got Parallel Wireless and Mavenir, and Red Hat coming from the US side of things. It's a pretty impressive group that they've pulled from different parts of the world, and I'm counting, was that 11, 12 vendors, and this is something we're seeing more commonly. I think in the early Open RAN sort of testing, we were seeing companies work with maybe 3 or 4 different vendors. Now we really are starting to see that much broader set of vendors coming in and supporting these initiatives. I think Rakuten, I'm going to get the number wrong here, but just for the radio part of their network, they've now tested and deployed radios from more than a dozen vendors in their network in Japan, and have met really sort of high-level performance requirements. There's a couple of reports out that have assessed how well their network performs versus their competitors domestically and around the world, and they got really good grades on that. Okay, so how can governments advance Open RAN? What we did as a coalition, because this is obviously a question that we got a lot from governments during our conversation, is, what is our role here? How can we impact deployments? And so we pulled together something called our Open RAN Policy Roadmap, which is our attempts to take all of the policy levers that a government could pull that would have an impact, and distill them into one document. It doesn't mean that every single one of these is applicable to every single government. There are different financial circumstances, there are different regulations on the book, and so on. But it does give you a starting point from the government side to say, okay, here's a range of ideas, and see what is most applicable for you. And as I'll show later on in the slide deck, we have worked with certain governments to take this document and put it in the context of their domestic situation, and sort of break down these recommendations into a smaller set that they can then go and implement. So we've done that for India, we've done that for Brazil, and we're working on one other at the moment. So this is quite high level, but to walk through each of these areas in turn: the fiscal, financial piece, regulatory, and convening. Within fiscal, we broke it out into supply side and demand side. Demand side being, how do you create incentives for operators to actually purchase equipment? Supply side being, how do you incentivize particularly vendors, to some extent operators, to invest in research and development. So on the supply side, typically you're going to invest in supply side if you want to grow a local ecosystem of vendors. So with this market becoming more competitive, with new vendors coming in, there's a significant opportunity for countries from around the world to have local vendors that can feed into that global market, or even just a domestic market or a regional market. Because there are lower barriers to entry, you don't necessarily need to be a very large scale global company in order to meet market needs. You might have a specific type of radio or something like that that can serve a particular need in a particular region of the world, and that could be very attractive for an operator to put into their network, whilst at the same time maybe it's not useful in a very dense urban area like Tokyo or New York, for instance. So a lot of governments are looking at the potential for, if we invested locally in research and development, could we have a kind of thriving local ecosystem? And if that's the objective of the government, then certainly these recommendations for supply side steps that can be taken will be of interest. The demand side, what you're typically looking to do is support operators in making their initial investments. For a lot of operators that have already sunk money into closed network architectures, there are initial costs with transitioning, and to the extent that governments can provide upfront incentives to ease that sort of hump, it certainly it speeds the process along. Japan has done this, and it's part of the reason that we see so many of their operators being so forward leaning on Open RAN. Regulatory. This one is quite vague, which I make no apologies for. It's almost impossible to, at a high level, given the breadth of regulations that are on the book in each country around the world, to say too much of detail. But the overarching theme is aligning your regulation with your objectives. So if your objective is to make it easier for companies to transition to an Open RAN network architecture, first and foremost, make sure that there are there's no laws on the books that would unintentionally prevent that. Driving forward next generation kind of network upgrades. I've put 5G in here, but it could equally be a transition from 3G to 4G because of that procurement cycle, because then operators are looking to upgrade their equipment to meet the new generation. Gives a good point in time for them to look at transitioning to Open RAN architectures as part of that transition. If they've just made massive investments in the latest generation in a closed network architecture a year or two ago, and they were expecting to amortize that investment over 10 years, it does make it more difficult from a business perspective to for Open RAN to be attractive to them. The last one on that left column is one that often surprises governments. We do not ask governments to mandate that all network architectures should be open, or that you should be using an Open RAN architecture. This is for a number of reasons. One, we're just generally opposed to government mandates most of the time, where there's where we're talking about technology, because technology changes, standards change, and in order to mandate the use of Open RAN, you're going to have to mandate the implementation of certain standards, and standards are always being updated. And so whilst there could be some short-term benefit there, we think it's outweighed by the creation of kind of a cliff edge or an issue further down the road that could ultimately inhibit future innovation. The right-hand column, coordinating internationally, is a big piece of the puzzle here. This we could have put in a number of different areas here. We flagged spectrum bands and security risk mitigation, but the point being, this is a global market that we're trying to develop here, and that we're seeing emerge. And to the extent that activity can be coordinated internationally, it not only speeds up adoption, but it avoids creating unintentional barriers. I'm just going to pause here, and because I see we've got a couple of questions. Okay, both of those are really good questions, but I think they're going to be longer answers from Clint and Arby. So I'm going to pause on those, and we'll come back to them at the end of the presentation, because I want to give them due time. Okay, final area is convening. Government has a unique position to be able to convene various stakeholders who have critical roles in the ecosystem. So this can be both technical collaboration, bringing companies together to launch pilots or test beds. It can be getting industry and academia work together on technical projects, or information sharing with other countries. This last area is something we're working on in a Quad context at the moment, because we found that there are so many test beds popping up around the world that are doing really good work. But if they're not sharing the information output with one another, we're not getting the full benefit of what they're learning through the process of testing. And you also end up with multiple test beds working on the same problems. And so we're not using our resources as efficiently as we can. So certainly where there is activity going on domestically, working in a regional or a global setting to get two-way information sharing going can be really helpful in making us more efficient in the work that we do. On the policy development side, naturally, again, you want to coordinate with partners. We've seen MOUs and joint statements between governments as being a really useful tool to signal to the market that governments are supportive of this transition and the benefits that'll come with it. But it's also so important for domestic policy development. I answered the question earlier about how difficult it is for incumbent operators. There is no kind of one pathway to Open RAN adoption. It's very dependent on where you are in your generation cycle, which vendors you have in your network already, and so on. And it's super critical that governments are engaging operators, engaging vendors to understand what some of the challenges are to deployments so that they can calibrate their policy accordingly. And I would say, in a US context, this is done very well, but there are a lot of governments you could look to who are doing great work on this. Brazil, for instance, has a standing Open RAN group with industry, kind of a policy group that meets monthly, I believe. The UK is constantly working with industry to gather their input. I mentioned the Japanese earlier. There are examples all over the world of governments that are doing a really good job here. Okay, this was one example, Open RAN for India, where we took that high-level document and we drilled it down for the government of India, and we basically said to them, look, what are some of the key objectives for India from a policy perspective in this space? And two of the big ones that we latched onto were Make in India, where the Indian government is trying to drive more and more product development domestically. And another was Connected India, where I believe about 500 million people in India still don't have reliable communications network access. So when you consider that from a global perspective, a large chunk of those people who are not connected reside in India, and the government, to their credit, is committing to try and get them connected. So latching into each of these, we kind of worked our way down of, okay, what are the components of Make in India that sort of would support that goal? Accelerating local deployments of Open RAN, building a domestic ecosystem of vendors, and promoting India as a global hub for telecoms R&D. And then beneath each of those, we had some kind of country-specific recommendations. So India has fantastic kind of technical universities, establishing Open RAN centers of excellence within those that would do high-level research on Open RAN telecoms infrastructure, can kind of reinforce that academia, financial, industry sort of triangle that reinforce one another. I won't go into each of these in detail, but just as an example of how we can take that high-level document and make it more relevant to the particular circumstances of any given country. Finally, some sort of recommendations as to where a particular country can go from here, having had an initial engagement. I think the keys to success are clearly identifying your goals for Open RAN. I guess this could apply equally to governments or operators, but are you looking to develop a lower cost infrastructure solution? Are you looking to close the digital divide and access communities that currently are not connected? Are you looking to diversify your vendor base, or in certain circumstances, remove certain vendors from your existing network infrastructure? It could be a combination of any of these, but having a clear understanding of what it is that you are trying to get out of Open RAN is a good starting point. The second goes back to the point I was making on a previous slide, engaging network operators to understand the potential barriers to deployment. Where are they in their equipment life cycle? From a financial standpoint, is that a particular challenge that they're facing? Are there regulations on the books that make it more difficult for them to deploy. In many cases, one thing we haven't got into here is the systems integration piece. If you're going from one vendor to, selecting one vendor out of 3 or 4 to an environment where you may be selecting dozens of vendors from a choice of hundreds around the world, not every network operator has the skill set in-house to be able to do that. For many, even many that we've spoken to recently, that's something that they feel they need to get more comfortable with before they're going to sort of commit to going down this path. Once you have an understanding of what are those barriers and where are you trying to get to as an end state, work with international partners. I think the Academy and USAID pulling together forums like this is a great example of how you can leverage international partners to help you along the way. The market's moving very quickly. Everybody is learning along the way. That includes operators around the world, vendors around the world. One of the best things that I like one of the reasons I like working in this particular issue area is that the collaboration and sharing from across them is kind of mind-blowing. I also work in cybersecurity as a field, and that's another one where we, friends share threat information with one another just to help them out. And I think that certainly is the case here as well. And so leverage that, talk to members of industry, to companies that are engaged in deployments around the world, talk to governments that are knowledgeable, and have them help you develop what a strategy might look like to move forward here. So we're at the 45-minute mark. That was a lot of me talking, and I can see some questions are popping up in the Q&A. So I can transition over to that, unless, I don't know, Kate or Richard, if there was any questions you wanted to ask me first.
What will be the best approach and your recommendation in implementing the digital transformation at the grassroots levels with the LGU in the Philippines?
Good question. So kind of harking back to that previous point that I just made, systems integrators are a great kind of category of company to reach out to, because they have a lot of experience of implementing the deployments across a range of circumstances, particularly if you look at some of the larger systems integrators in the market. So I'm thinking Mavenir, IBM, Tech Mahindra, TCS, even a Deloitte. There's probably a Rakuten, NEC. I'm probably missing some there, so that there are others as well. But basically, they have the best view into the market and are probably the most knowledgeable of addressing the very specific circumstances and a range of very specific circumstances. So I think you can't go wrong in reaching out to them and learning from their experiences.
Okay, thank you, Alex. And next is coming from RV Escalona. What have you found to be the biggest obstacles in the ORPC to bringing Open RAN technology to other nations?
Good question. Let's run through some of the big ones. Where you are in a brownfield environment and there are existing closed networks in place, there can be some technological challenges with making that transition. But more importantly, there is a range of willingness amongst incumbent vendors to help you make that transition. Understand that from their perspective, they currently build solutions from end to end, right? So your RU, your DU, your CU, they're providing end-to-end solutions, and we're moving to a world in which there's far greater specialization. So certain companies have looked at that and said, we understand this is where the market's going. We want to be a part of it. And even if we end up specializing and maybe not providing full end-to-end solutions, that's where it's going, and we want to be helpful. Certain other vendors have effectively said, we're not going to play ball with Open RAN, or we're going to make it quite difficult to do so. And that does make it difficult, frankly. If your 3G and 4G infrastructure is with a vendor that is unwilling to be helpful and let you layer on top, you effectively need to build a parallel network infrastructure, a standalone 5G network. And that can be quite costly, which goes into a second factor. Very dependent upon the circumstances of a particular operator. There are many circumstances where Open RAN has proven to lower the overall cost of a network build out. And there will be some circumstances where, because you effectively need to build parallel networks, it is more costly, which is where we get to those points earlier about how governments can help certain operators with incentives to get over that initial hump so that they can make that transition into Open RAN. I would also say a lack of familiarity, or I should say a lack of confidence in where in the skills that they will need to integrate. This is something we typically hear from smaller vendors that maybe don't have smaller operators that maybe don't have the same level of resources in-house. They look at it and say, there are hundreds of vendors out there. We need to integrate possibly, a dozen of them into our network architecture. I don't know how to do that. And I guess the answer to that question is systems integrators can play that function of, we describe it as one back to pat or one throat to choke. So one back to pack if it's going well, and one throat to choke if it's going wrong. They like that single point of contact. You can still get that in an Open RAN architecture. That's what a system integrator does. But because it's a change, there can be nervousness with change in any walk of life. And I guess that gets into the final area, is just status quo bias. The industry has worked on a single vendor model for decades now, and chief technology officers, who are often in charge of the procurement, are naturally a risk-averse bunch, because they are charged with building the networks and making sure that nothing goes wrong. And if they do that, then they are very well supported within their companies. Doing something new to them is always going to seem scary. And so whilst you might have a CEO that looks at it and says, we could be making cost savings here, or we could have greater competition and new innovation coming onto our network, typically, and I'm overstating, there are many CTOs who are big Open RAN advocates, but many chief technology officers or operators are going to be risk averse. And so they would rather be the 10th operator that makes the transition to Open RAN than the first.
Thank you, Alex. So RV, I hope you get that comprehensive answer from Alex. The question. Okay, Alex, there's another question from Kate Dinsdale. I had a question about opportunities you have seen through your work with the private sector, other SDOs and government stakeholders in the Indo-Pacific specifically. Any in the Philippines that you have heard of or are able to share?
I have to be honest, no, I have not. I think this might be our first engagement in the Philippines. I would have to check who your incumbent operators are to say with confidence. In fact, I can probably pull up that as we speak to say if we've engaged with any of them in the past, but no, I don't think we've engaged with any of the major network operators yet. It's quite possible, though, that they are members of the ORAN Alliance or of TIP. So it's quite possible one of those groups have, but we have not engaged directly with them.
Okay, coming from Rinaldo de Guzman. So with 5G deployment being mentioned, does that mean we can't get Open RAN started on a national scale until we get key region to become fully operational on 5G.
Look, there are 4G Open RAN deployments. I think where we have a little bit of bias in talking about it is, many of the first countries to move forward were doing so at a point in time they were transitioning to 5G. So that was the case with Japan. That's the case with Dish in the US, but certainly there are a number of deployments that are on 4G networks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Next, coming from Alvin Marcelo, would remote islands with no network infrastructure be considered greenfield? And being remote with few residents, would they be palatable to vendors since vendor participation is important?
Yeah, absolutely. So with greenfield, we just mean anywhere that you're building a standalone network. So that could be because there's no network infrastructure, or because the existing network infrastructure isn't fit for purpose, and so you're starting from scratch in that area. But anytime you're not building on top of existing infrastructure, so absolutely, that would be a great example. We've had conversations. Well, I mentioned earlier Indonesia and the project that Tip's doing out there. Obviously, Indonesia being an archipelago with many islands, that is part of the reason that it's such an interesting case study. We've had discussions with islands in the Caribbean that are in similar circumstances, and in many ways, it is a great opportunity for a small scale deployment because you can learn your lessons in a way that's not going to mean that there's a mistake made in the capital city and a lot of users are knocked offline. Even better if it's in an area where there was no existing infrastructure, because nobody could possibly be worse off, right? If there's no existing infrastructure, you put it in, you need to do, a couple of months of tuning and updating to meet your performance requirements. None of that is inhibiting existing network users. So those are some of the best examples.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Alex. Next question coming from John Kurt. Assuming it's comparing Open RAN and traditional one. So is it more safer than the traditional one, and why?
Good question. So I could easily say yes, but I'm going to give you the more nuanced answer, which is that you're kind of comparing different security aspects. So the challenge with single vendor network architecture is twofold. One, you've got a concentration of vendors globally. So if, for instance, you've got 3 vendors that are providing all of the network infrastructure, and it turns out one of those vendors has a significant vulnerability in their network infrastructure, then that's just going to hit a far larger volume than if a company that provides 1% of the world's radios is found to have a vulnerability. The breadth of impact of that is going to be much smaller. So having a diversification of vendors is advantageous from a security perspective. With open network architectures as well, you have greater visibility into what's happening on the network. The existing model has been described as security by obscurity. As an operator, you cannot, you don't have great visibility into what's happening on your network. Your vendor does, but you do not. In an open network architecture, you have far greater visibility into what's happening at each layer of the network. Also, with a transition to more software-based networking, particularly when you get to the 5G level, there are any number of security capabilities that we already deploy in cloud infrastructure, cloud computing infrastructure, that can be leveraged for the telecommunications ecosystem. And so there'll be benefits from bringing those to bear. I'm thinking things like responding to a DDoS attack, distributed denial of service attack, and being able to direct more compute power to basically subvert that type of attack, which you can't do as easily in an existing network architecture. You can also deploy updates and patches much more quickly and readily. So that's the good piece. The bit that is harder is the supply chain management, right? You got more vendors in your network. You have to assess the security worthiness of those vendors and from both a technical level of their specific equipment, but also the trustworthiness of that particular company. That is a more complex task. You always had that supply chain risk because even your Nokia's, Ericsson's, Huawei's of the world have subcontractors, but the assumption was that they were doing that work. In an Open RAN architecture, either the operator or the systems integrator has to do that work. So it's not like it's an entirely new problem, but where the responsibility lies is going to shift a little bit. And from an operator's perspective, if you choose to do all of that integration in-house, that's something you've got to have a capability to do.
Thank you, Alex. Okay, next question coming from Carlo. If we have a 3G, LTE, or 5G equipment from Huawei or ZTE in our network, is it feasible to go for Open RAN?
I don't know with ZTE. I think the answer is it's very difficult. I know the answer with Huawei is it's very difficult. And that is for the reason that, as I understand it, Huawei does not play ball, does not make it easy for operators to integrate Open RAN equipment on top of Huawei equipment. And Huawei does not, it's the only major vendor in the world that does not, it's not a member of the O-RAN Alliance and therefore does not help with the development of those standards. And frankly, from a business perspective, they're the lowest cost provider of the major players in the world for various reasons, which we don't need to go into detail here, but I presume that they see no incentive. They like the market as it is with limit, with a small number of companies providing competition to them, and so they choose not to not to be supportive of a transition to Open RAN, is my understanding.
Okay, thank you, Alex. Question coming from Benjamin Labadan. Sir Alex, reflecting on your phrase, if there are laws that are unintentionally preventing it a while ago, I ask if greenfields or brownfields have to wait until a law that affects the intended deployment has already been either enacted or amended in the particular country where they operate before they will put the whole system into operation, or they may do the construction already after they have passed the corresponding bill to the concerned Congress and then wait until the bill was passed into law or the relevant law has already been amended before they will put the newly deployed system into operation?
Yeah, so that's going to be a complex answer because, well, firstly, the laws are going to vary from country to country. The process for implementing equipment, is going to vary from country to country. So it's going to be a country specific answer to it. And my firm always makes me tell people that I'm not a lawyer, even though I work at a law firm, because I don't want people to have the impression that I'm a lawyer. That is very much true when you're talking about hundreds of countries around the world. I don't have a detailed answer there, but I'm going to give a hypothetical example. If a government had a law on the books saying any telecommunications equipment that is put into networks in our country must be certified against X 4G standard that is not, it's not built upon Open RAN standards, then that equipment may not be able to qualify, even though it meets the same performance and security standards, because it's requiring that they be certified against a standard that comes from elsewhere. And so you could get a situation like that where the law was put on the books before Open RAN standards even existed or before the relevant 3GPP standards. And so it just acts as a barrier to companies being able to put those into the network, even if that wasn't the intention of the government. And what we're trying to say is basically operators should flag where problems exist. Governments should be engaged with their operators, be responsive to them, and ensure that there's nothing on the book that would unintentionally prevent them. I would say we've had very few examples of this in the wild, in real life, but it is something that governments should at least be aware of.
Okay. Thank you, Alex. And we go to our last question for this session from Invictus Fiesta. What is the most challenging study in starting Open RAN policy?
What's the most challenging? I would say the biggest challenge that governments have is understanding the latest of what is going on from a technical perspective, because this is a very new space, and because even my understanding of Open RAN and what challenges are being faced from a technical standpoint and where there are deployments around the world, I'm constantly outdated on my knowledge, and I'm somebody who's focused on this, pretty much full time. And so for governments that have a much broader remit and policy officials that have a much broader remit, just staying up to date on the latest and greatest is a very difficult challenge, which is why part of what we try to do, in addition to engagement and advocacy with governments, is that educational piece where we bring things together like that map I showed you earlier, so that there's a quick resource that people can leverage. But I think if I go back to those 3 points that I made at the end of my presentation, the understanding your objectives is something that, governments can do quite easily. I think reaching out to their counterparts and engaging with them, or engaging with network operators, generally they have experience of doing, but it's that, understanding the latest and greatest, which is the hard part to stay on top of.
Okay, there's one follow-up question from Leslie. Hi, Sir Alex. Based on your experience, if you are going to assess our network standards and status, what would be the strategies and difficulties if we are going to integrate to ORAN?
Yeah, I think this kind of harkens back to one of the questions we had earlier. The barriers to Open RAN cut across the sort of technical difficulties with backwards integration and how much your incumbent vendor is willing to work with you on that. There's the question of, do you integrate the network yourself, in which case you've got to hire people, and we didn't even get into this yet, but the whole workforce development issue. If all operators in the Philippines decided they want to integrate themselves, then they all need to develop that capability in-house, which means they all need to hire people who have those capabilities. And so you could potentially have a challenge around workforce development, which is yet another area where governments can play such a critical role, right, in educating people with the right skill set so that they can meet those market needs, versus if you decide to outsource that function and you can sort of leverage global talent by going with a Japanese integrator or an Indian integrator or a European integrator or what have you. But yeah, I'd mainly kind of harken back to my previous answer on that, which was much more comprehensive.
Yep. Okay. Thank you so much, Alex, for attending all the questions. And that's it. And then before you go, please don't forget to like us, share, and follow us on Facebook for more activities and events hosted by Asia Open RAN Academy.